This is the key to worksheet 16.1 part A. In this case, you're simplifying these radicals, and these are all square roots. So number one, you have the square root of a negative 25. Now you do have to use the fact that the square root of a negative 1 is equal to the imaginary unit I. So remember in a previous lesson, you learned that the square root of a negative 5 is not a real number. That's true because no real number times itself is negative. A real number times itself is either positive or 0. But we are now talking in this part now, we are now talking about imaginary numbers. So what you need to do is think about this way. So you have the square root of a negative 1, the square root of negative 25 is the square root of a negative 1 times the square root of 25. And so that's I, square root of a negative 1 is I, and then the square root of 25 is 5, so you get 5I. Number two, that's an easy one. The square root of 100 is, 100 is a perfect square, so that'll be 10, because 10 times 10 is 100. And then the same thing with number one for this one. So you have the square root of a negative 1 times the square root of 64. Many students forget about that negative, so be careful. So the square root of a negative 1 is I, square root of 64, 8 times 8 is 64. So you get 8 times I. Okay, now here, think about it this way. So the square root of a negative 21, that'll be the square root of a negative 1 times the square root of 21. Square root of a negative 1 we know is I. The square root of 21, there is no perfect square that goes into 21. So your answer is going to be I, square root of 21. Now, be very careful. Some of you don't write it like this. So don't write as this. Some of you write it as square root of 21. Oops, that's 21. Square root of 21. And you have an I like this, like your I is underneath the square root. That cannot be. All right, so the I cannot be under the square root. So that's why it's always a good idea to put the I in front. So that way you don't make that mistake. Okay? All right, now number 5. So you're going to use some ideas from a previous lesson here, but the first thing I would do is I would rewrite this as the square root of a negative 1 times the square root of 24. And the square root of negative 1 I know is I. Now let's talk about 24. What perfect square goes into 24? Because I can simplify this. Besides 1, the largest is 4. So it becomes the square root of 4 times the square root of 6. And so this is I times 2 times the square root of 6, and we prefer to write it as such, 2I square root of 6. So again, don't put the I in back, because if you put it too close to the radical, it looks like it's underneath, and you won't get full credit. All right, so put the I between this number and the radical and the square root. All right. Okay, number 6, you have 4 times, okay, so this will be the square root of a negative 1, right? Times the square root of 45. So I have 4 times I. Now let's talk about 45. What perfect square goes into 45? Besides 1, let's look at the largest, and so we'd say 9, right? So it'll be the square root of 9 times the square root of 5, because 9 times 5 is 45. And so this becomes 4 times I times 3, square root of 9 is 3, square root of 5, and then 4 times 3 is 12, so you get 12I square root of 5. That goes here, 12I square root of 5. Okay, now remember, you make sure you know how to read this. You've had something like this in the past, so this is the opposite. That means the opposite of the square root of a negative 81. That's what that means. All right, so let's talk about the square root of a negative 81. So that's the opposite of, okay, I can write square root of negative 81 as square root of a negative 1 times the square root of 81, right? And so that's negative I times 9, so that's negative 9I. So that's your answer, negative 9I. Okay, number 8, so we get negative 2 times the square root of a negative 1 times the square root of 108. Okay, so let's talk about a perfect square that goes into 108. Let's try, besides 1, let's try 4. Let's see if 4 will go to 108. So 108 divided by 4 equal 27. But 4 is not the largest, and the reason I know 4 is not the largest is because you see that 27? What other perfect square goes into 27? 9. So 9 times 4. And 36, 9 times 4 is 36. So 36 is the largest, because look, 108 divided by 36 equal 3. All right. So you got to think like that. So you have negative 2 times I times the square root of 36 times the square root of 3. And then the square root of 36 is 6. I get negative 2I times 6 times the square root of 3. And negative 2 times 6 is negative 12I square root of 3. Okay? All right. And then number 9. So you have -6. All right. Now, this doesn't involve an I because I'm not taking the square of a negative number. The only time you have that I is when you're taking the square root of a negative number. All right. So that'll be, let's see, the largest perfect square that goes into 75 is 25. So I get the square root of 25 times the square root of 3, right? So that's -6 times 5 times the square root of 3. That's -30 square root of 3. All right, next one. So that's 8. And this would square root of -200 would be the square root of a -1 times the square root of 200. So that's going to be 8i. Now the square root of 200, 100 goes into 200. That's the largest perfect square. So it'll be the square root of 100 times the square root of 2. And so that's 8i times 10 square root of 2 times the square root of 2. 8 times 10 is 80, so you get 80i square root of 2. All right, so that's going to take care of the key to worksheet 16.1, part A.